Very special thanks, of course, to Affordable Prestige Cars, located in Glastonbury in the southwest of England, for providing the Bentley in this review. And of course, if you are in the market for something like a Bentley like this one, maybe even a Continental GT, or even something like a Jaguar, Range Rover, etc. in that luxury segment, then of course you can check out their current stock or even get in contact with them via the link right below this video in the description. I've already reviewed a couple of very interesting Bentleys on the channel, in particular the Continental range, from the Continental GTC to even a Super Sport with over 620 horsepower, and even my own flying Spur that I had for a while. Those all fall around that similar W12 formula though. This one is the one that's notably different straight off the bat, and I would say that they're actually quite remarkable in terms of falling into a similar age range in some cases. They even fall into a similar price bracket here in the UK. Certainly high milers are similar, entering the market at around 14, 15,000, more commonly in the 20, kind of 30,000 region, and even as high as about 50,000 for a later model with higher performance. And yet there is almost zero crossover between the two, which is kind of strange when you think about it for cars with big engines, a lot of luxury, even from the same brand. Why are they so different? Well, because this one, as I highlighted in the thumbnail, is kind of the last quote-unquote traditional Bentley, if you will. The last of the big Bentleys to be out of the Crewe factory rather than this new style of Volkswagen-developed machine with the Veyron Tech W12 engines. And of course, fantastic sales. They sold around 80,000 W12 cars, so clearly the market was ready for it, but those are very much new Bentley. New money, new style. Even visually, they're very different. They're much rounder and sleeker, almost more supercar or GT car-esque. Whereas something like an Arnage, and of course its rival, the Rolls-Royce Seraph, they're very traditional, very deliberately so. Like a Morgan, they are specifically designed to be traditional because that is the essence that they're trying to capture. The question is then, do they manage that? Well, I would say it really depends on what you're looking for from a car, because if you're looking for a Bentley but you are more of a traditionalist, if perhaps you're an older driver or maybe even a younger driver who just likes a more old school luxury experience, like that old money British vibe of a Jaguar, a Sovereign, a Daimler, a Rolls, these kind of traditional old money, very boxy luxury limousines, then absolutely it ticks that. If you're looking more for the performance side of Bentley, more of the motorsport side, well then the Continental series is probably more your thing, and of course I've done reviews, as I said, for those if you want to check them out. But they are certainly very, very different, and one of the ironic things about these is, of course, Volkswagen owned Bentley at the time. They were redeveloping the car from existing platforms like the Turbo R, etc. that had gone before it, but bringing it more up to date into a newer era. And then, of course, their main rivals, BMW, owned Rolls-Royce, as they still do. But curiously, Volkswagen actually built a few of these cars with BMW engines, funnily enough, 4.4-litre twin-turbo V8s. Those are a lot rarer on the market, though, with the much more easy-to-find Red Label versions, such as this one with the 6.75-litre V8, being the ones that you will typically find. These have more power, significantly more torque, but the payoff is that they are also more traditional in their approach, so they're not quite as efficient, they're not quite as frugal, although any Bentley being called frugal is a stretch for sure, and they are more torque-based rather than horsepower-based, even though the big V8 does definitely have more horsepower, around 400 to roughly 350-ish on the 4.4-litre cars. If you are looking for the traditional experience, certainly one which you know under that bonnet harkens back to a bygone year, then absolutely the 6.75 is the car for you. If I were to buy one of these, I would definitely go for that one, because efficiency be damned. You know, I drive classic American cars, so clearly I don't care about efficiency. It's more about the feel, it's about the vibe, it's about the kind of driving experience that it gives you, and if you care about miles per gallon, or to be honest, even performance, then it's not really the car for you. Just like with my classic Continental, but not a Bentley, it's a Lincoln instead, performance is not even something that I even think about. It's all about the effortless power, the effortless torque, the way it sounds, the way it looks, the way it drives, the comfort, and the way it feels. America's approach was very much so like that in the 50s and 60s, and likewise with cars like Rolls-Royce, Bentley, etc., in terms of that big luxury limousine experience. This is just about the most modern interpretation you can find of that traditional experience. So I would say for somebody who really loves that vibe, but wants a car that has the huge advantage of being way newer, probably better condition, far less rust, if any, in comparison to a classic car, probably lower mileage, depending on your budget, less owners, a more easily traceable history in terms of servicing, and of course easier access to parts. That's when a newer machine, a newer platform, even using older tech, is going to have an advantage. Now in the case of these ones, I would say that something like the 4.4 litre almost feels pointless, to be honest. I'm sure they're great to drive, being about 600 pounds lighter, which is a good quarter of a tonne, which is quite a difference. But again, driving dynamics aren't really what this is about, which makes me find it curious that there's even something called the Arnage T, or the Le Mans edition, which have even up to 500 horsepower in some cases. Who is really buying that? Because it's the same kind of price region to a Continental GT, which even in their base form has 550 horsepower, and is a way faster car with much more supercar-esque dynamics, and of course the huge advantage of all-wheel drive. So I really don't see who would want this platform with that kind of power. It seems like a bit of a drivable contradiction in terms of its overall vibe, but each to their own, I guess. There is a niche for pretty much everything. The vast majority of ones that you'll find, though, will be more like this one. I would say that this, in comparison to a Continental series, feels like a 90% luxury, 10% performance kind of car. It has all the performance you need, but not really anything extra than that, because that's not what it's about. Whereas a Continental, be it a GT with the 2 doors, the Flying Spur with 4 doors, or a convertible, that's more like a 50-50, I would say. Maybe even a 55-45 in favour of performance, because for everything luxury about the car, there's 2 things about performance. It suits them very well, and as I said, they are very popular, so clearly that formula works. This, though, is that more traditional approach. It really is a case of doing exactly what it looks like on the tin, and I think that's good, because you don't go into buying a car like this because you want to take it to the Nürburgring and break a record. At least most people don't. You buy it because you like Bentleys, you like Rolls-Royce models, you like this wedding car for the road kind of experience, either as a collector's piece for the weekend or even as something which you use more regularly. And for that, I think it does tick the right boxes. Now, in terms of pricing, as I said earlier on, it really does depend on how much you want to spend. At least currently on, for example, Auto Trader, you can pay as low as $14,000 for a really high mileage car, like up around 110, 120,000, privately owned. Always very risky, something like that when it's a Bentley, speaking from experience. Then you can go all the way up to like 50 grand for as low as like 10, 15,000 miles, more likely a T or a Le Mans edition. So, like I said, it depends on what your budget is, it depends on what you want from the car, if you do want that additional performance. I mean, these cars ran from 1998 to 2009, so there's plenty to choose from within that time. There were very subtle facelifts, and of course the same essential platform is carried over to other cars as well, like the Azure, and personally one of my favourite Bentleys in terms of its design, the Brooklands, which I think is just an incredible looking car, and a very, very expensive one as well. In the case of transmissions, that's another interesting one. The gearboxes were a bit varied in these. The vast majority that you'll find have a 4-speed GM transmission. Funnily enough, to go back to the American side of things, then you'll find some with a 5-speed ZF, and then interestingly, from the more 2006-2009 kind of region, a HP 626 ZF, a 6-speed, which is a very familiar gearbox to any fans of the Maserati Quattroporte facelift, such as the ones that I had, and of course the Jag XKR, or even the Rolls-Royce Phantom. It's a very, very well-used gearbox. More commonly, as I said, though, you will find the 4-speeds. Again, it's more about the torque, it's more about the cruising, not so much about the performance. That being said, though, because of the sheer torque of the engine, the 0 to 60 time when you need it actually is not bad at all. These can shift to 60 miles an hour in less than 6 seconds. In today's modern time with electric cars, etc., sub 2-second 0 to 60 times are all the rage, but if you really think about it, getting something this size from a standing start to motorway speed in 6 seconds, That's realistically more performance than you would ever usually need in a platform like this. So if you are looking for a very traditional, very retro modern, you could even call it, approach to a Bentley, and certainly, and I think this is one of the crucial advantages that these have over the Rolls-Royce Seraph, pricing. That huge advantage on pricing, even for a great one. Take this exact car that I'm driving, this is in the 25 grand region, compared to the equivalent mileage Seraph would be more like 40, 50,000. Well, that's a massive, massive difference in price for a very similar result at the end of the day. Sure, this has a V8, the Rolls has a V12, but again, it's not like the performance really matters anyway. You're pretty much paying for the badge at that point, which has pretty much been the story of Bentley versus Rolls-Royce since the very beginning. You've always been choosing the badge that you wanted. Rolls-Royce has always had the badge advantage, and Bentley's always had a bit of a performance and motorsport advantage. That's always been the key thing in both corners, so it really comes down to what you want. And ultimately, when it came to the development and modernization of these platforms, the Red Label, Green Label for example, they did a number of things to modernize the platform. Traditional still, but also modern at the same time. Probably most notably larger wheels, more powerful brakes, which were then offset by the higher weight of course, stiffer body rigidity as well. They had the pop-up navigation screen also as standard, which you can see in this car. Of course parking sensors, which come in handy. And of course more legroom as well, which comes from a revised seating setup in the back. So if you do plan to, for example, use one as, say, a hire car, a wedding car, that's something to bear in mind as well. They have power mirrors as well, which of course the more classic models wouldn't have had. And crucially, this is quite a notable difference, improved steering at lower speeds. So the maneuverability, for example, when parking is improved over the older cars. So that kind of real world stuff, which makes more of a difference in general life, rather than just high performance extremes, that's where you'll notice those differences. Overall, both this car, with its inception in 1998, and the equivalent Rolls-Royce Silver Seraph, they were both the first altogether new models for the brands since around 1980. So it was a big deal for them. And although these cars are not the most obvious choice of Bentley now that the W12s exist, I would say that there's definitely still a market for it among those who want a more traditionalist, more of an aficionados experience. If a classic Bentley is something which really appeals to you, but maybe you don't want something from the 80s, but then perhaps don't want to stretch the bank so much to get a classic Bentley or Rolls-Royce for silly money, then these are a very, very good, very logical next step. You have the advantages of a newer, probably lower mileage, certainly easier to track its history car for a much more reasonable price, and yet you get much of what made those classics so good in the first place. And for me, I love those little touches, like for example how great the door access is. When you open it, you can kind of swing in and out of the seat. The little touches like how the button on the door handle, you still press it in with your thumb, like a very classic feel. They resisted the urge to update these smaller things, which is more about the driver interface. You still have a classic feel in terms of buttons and switches, which could have very easily just been updated to some kind of touchscreen this or rubber button that, and they resisted that urge wherever possible. I think that that was a good choice, because having as much of a classic feel is really what many of these cars are all about, and this definitely still does, right down until having this nifty little feature on the boot where you lift up the Bentley badge, put the key in to unlock the back. Very classic style on what is not really a classic car, a much more modern approach. So just like Morgan, just like many other brands like that, there's definitely a market for a car like this, and I think if you are interested in it, I would certainly recommend checking one out. I think my ultimate recommendation, and I don't think this will apply to everyone because there's not a huge amount of crossover there, but chances are, if you do find a dealership who has something like an Arnage for sale, chances are they probably have a Continental or two for sale also. So even if you're not in the market for a Continental, or even vice versa, I would actually still recommend checking them both out. And if possible, at least going out in them, if not test driving them both. Because even if you don't want both of them, I think it will give you an appreciation for both their completely unique development and feel compared to each other, and also give you more of a point of reference and perspective of how different these cars feel within the same brand, and at the same time even. Very much the pivot point between the last of the old money Bentleys and the first of the new money, as the Arnage was redefined but also going away at the same time, and then the Continental was coming in. So certainly check one out, and if it sounds like it does interest you, then I would say for sure try and test drive one if you can. And of course, as I always like to say, if you used to have one of these, if you still have, in any kind of variation, maybe even something like an Azure or a Brooklands, a slightly different variation, then of course put your stories, anecdotes, warnings perhaps, or even recommendations down in the comments for other potential buyers or owners to benefit from. And of course, if you want to check out my other reviews for the Bentleys or beyond, of course you can find those here on the channel. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.